He didn't notice me, but I gave him everything I had. And still, he didn't see it. It's emotionally charged, instantly relatable, and sets up curiosity for the slow burn tension. I can also give 3 alternative hooks if you want multiple options to test engagement. Do you want me to do that? The first time he saw her, it was nothing remarkable on the surface. Just another Thursday morning, the cafe bustling with the usual clatter of cups and low murmurs. Yet, something about her presence cut through the ordinary. She wasn't loud or overtly striking, but there was a quiet gravity in the way she moved, an effortless grace that seemed entirely her own. He noticed how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing her cheek, and the small, almost imperceptible smile that flickered across her face as she glanced at a book she'd been flipping through. He sat at a corner table, nursing his coffee more out of habit than thirst, and yet he couldn't look away. There was a subtle rhythm to her motions, the way her wrist rested lightly on the counter, the delicate tilt of her head as she read. For a moment, he caught the soft hum of her voice when she spoke to the barista, just a gentle lilt, a tone that felt almost like a melody too intimate to be shared. His chest tightened in a way he couldn't explain, the kind of sudden, quiet awareness that something or someone has touched a part of you before you even realize it. It wasn't just her physical presence, though that alone drew him in. It was the aura of someone who had lived and yet still carried a certain vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. He imagined the weight of experiences behind her poised posture, the unspoken stories hidden in her eyes, and the subtle sigh she gave as she sat down to enjoy her drink. He felt almost like an intruder, quietly observing the life of someone so poised, yet palpably human. He noticed the warmth of the sunlight catching her hair as she shifted in her seat, the way the light seemed to outline her silhouette with soft radiance. A small laugh escaped her lips when she read something amusing, a sound that made him startle in its sudden intimacy. He imagined how it would feel to lean closer and hear it without the distance of the cafe separating them. There was no overt interaction yet, only glances that lingered just a second too long, the faint awareness of her presence that somehow seemed to fill the space between them. He found himself studying the gentle curve of her shoulders beneath the fabric of her blouse, the understated elegance in her movements, the quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but inevitably drew it. By the time she left, a subtle ache remained in him, a mixture of curiosity and longing he didn't fully understand. He hadn't spoken a word to her, hadn't even caught her name, yet something inside him had shifted. He realized with a pang of awareness that this moment, brief, fleeting, and utterly ordinary to anyone else, had planted a seed. A pull toward her that wasn't about infatuation, not yet, but about noticing, about feeling, about wanting to understand her world without ever crossing the line into intrusion. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible longing, the story had begun. It happened completely by accident. He hadn't planned to see her again, but life has a subtle way of arranging moments when you least expect them. She was standing near the small courtyard outside the cafe, a light breeze lifting strands of her hair across her face. She was reaching for something she had dropped, a notebook, its cover slightly scuffed, the pages fluttering in the wind. Without thinking, he stepped forward, picking it up before it could tumble again. "Here, you dropped this," he said, holding it out. His hand brushed against hers, fleeting yet startling in its effect. Her fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and in that instant, he became acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the subtle softness that seemed to match the quiet composure in her eyes. "Oh, thank you," she murmured, her voice gentle but threaded with something he couldn't yet name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of recognition. Her eyes held his for a heartbeat longer than expected, and he felt the quiet pull of familiarity, though they had never truly met. They walked together for a few steps toward the cafe entrance, the conversation stilted at first. He noticed the slight tilt of her shoulder as she shifted the notebook to her other hand, the way her coat moved lightly in the wind, the subtle scent of her perfume, something soft, almost floral, lingering just behind her. It wasn't overpowering, yet it clung to memory like a whisper. He tried to focus on casual conversation, small talk about the weather or the bustling street around them, but every word seemed secondary to the rhythm of her presence beside him. The gentle way her hand brushed against his arm as she adjusted the notebook, the quiet attentiveness in her gaze. Every detail rooted him firmly in the moment. For a fleeting second, he imagined this encounter stretching endlessly, each step side by side, the ordinary sound of the world fading into a backdrop for the subtle intimacy forming between them. His heart thrummed with something unfamiliar, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and a cautious yearning that he dared not fully name. She smiled when he mentioned something trivial about the cafe, a small, knowing smile that hinted at humor, at understanding, at a depth he could sense but not yet touch. And then, almost instinctively, their hands brushed again as they reached the door. It was brief, almost negligible, but left a trace, a warm imprint that lingered longer than the moment itself. When she entered the cafe, he lingered at the doorway, watching her find her seat, tucking the notebook beside her coffee cup. He realized he didn't want to leave, didn't want this accidental brush with her life to end so abruptly. But he did. He retreated, carrying the strange, quiet ache of someone who had glimpsed something rare, something entirely unspoken, yet undeniably compelling. By the time he sat back down with his own coffee, the ordinary sounds of the cafe had returned. But he couldn't stop replaying the moment. The notebook, her fingers brushing his, the faint warmth of her presence. He understood, then, that chance encounters aren't always accidental. Sometimes, they're the beginning of something you didn't know you were waiting for. And so, the story began to take shape. Not with words, but with touches, glances, and a quiet curiosity that refused to let go. Their second encounter felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability. He saw her again at the same cafe, tucked into a corner with the soft glow of morning sunlight painting the edges of her hair. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked over, carrying a quiet determination he hadn't known he possessed, and asked if he could share her table. She looked up, startled for a moment, then allowed it with a polite nod, her eyes holding a flicker of curiosity, almost amusement. Sitting across from her, he noticed every subtle detail. The faint crease at the corner of her smile, the way her hand rested on the table as if unconsciously drawing lines in the light, the gentle rhythm of her breath as she sipped her coffee. He felt a strange awareness of the space between them, the almost magnetic pull of presence that wasn't about proximity, but about attention. They talked about trivial things at first, books, music, the oddities of the city waking up around them. And yet, even in the simplest conversation, there was something unspoken threading through every pause, every glance. When she laughed softly at one of his comments, he noticed how her eyes crinkled at the edges, how her fingers lingered near his hand, brushing lightly against the tablecloth in a motion that seemed both casual and deliberate. For the first time, he realized that conversation could be an intimacy all its own. He noticed how she leaned slightly forward when sharing her thoughts, the subtle movements that betrayed a quiet engagement. And when he spoke, she listened, not out of obligation, but with a presence that made him feel seen in ways he hadn't experienced before. There were moments when their hands brushed accidentally, while reaching for sugar or adjusting their cups. And he felt the warmth linger longer than expected, a tiny jolt of connection that neither of them acknowledged aloud. His chest would tighten, not in alarm, but in awareness of the delicate thread beginning to form between them. He found himself watching her in fleeting, careful ways, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her gaze would drift toward a window and soften with reflection. She seemed unaware of the effect she had, or perhaps deliberately unconcerned. That indifference, or was it confidence, made him more captivated, more aware of the subtle tension building in the shared silence between words. By the time their coffees were empty, a quiet understanding had settled between them. There was no rush, no overt admission, only the mutual recognition that something fragile and unspoken had begun. When she finally smiled as he stood to leave, it wasn't a smile of courtesy. It was a soft acknowledgement, almost a promise of curiosity yet to unfold. As he walked away, he felt the strange ache of wanting more, tempered by the awareness that this connection, however brief and delicate, was rare. He didn't need her to notice him in any grand way. He only needed to be present, to witness the small, meaningful moments that made her entirely herself. In that initial connection, something quietly shifted. What had started as observation and longing became understanding, recognition, and a tentative curiosity that promised the slow, deliberate unfolding of something far more profound. It was late afternoon when he saw her again, this time walking slowly along the quiet park path, the sun casting a golden glow through the branches overhead. She wasn't alone with her usual poise. There was a subtle heaviness in her steps, a weight he recognized immediately, even before words were exchanged. Without thinking, he fell in a step beside her, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet marking a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then, quietly, she spoke, her voice low and unguarded, as if testing the waters of trust. She shared a fragment of her story, a recent disappointment, the ache of loneliness, the subtle fear of vulnerability she usually kept hidden. He listened, each word settling deep inside him, echoing with empathy he hadn't expected to feel so intensely. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she spoke, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, the faint flush on her cheeks that made her seem both composed and fragile all at once. Without thinking, he reached out to brush a loose strand of hair from her face, tucking it gently behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Her eyes softened, and he felt the quiet weight of her trust settle like a fragile promise in the space between them. The world around them faded. The rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the occasional bark of a dog. All of it receded until the only thing that existed was the rhythm of their breathing, the subtle warmth of proximity, and the careful tension of unspoken desire. When she paused mid-sentence, he glanced at her profile and caught the soft line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, the vulnerability in her gaze. He felt drawn to her, not in a fleeting, impulsive way, but with the quiet intensity of someone who recognizes the weight of another's heart. There was a pause, long enough that silence itself seemed to hum between them. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but he stayed still, aware that sometimes presence spoke louder than words. And in that silence, she leaned slightly closer, resting a hand near his arm, tentative but deliberate. The warmth of her skin against his, though subtle, sent a ripple through him, a quiet acknowledgement of trust and closeness. "I don't usually," she began, then faltered, leaving the words unspoken. He simply nodded, offering the steadiness she didn't even realize she needed. His gaze met hers, steady, patient, understanding, a silent reassurance that she didn't have to guard herself completely. They continued walking, the conversation ebbing and flowing between trivialities and confessions, but the unspoken intimacy deepened with every step. Each glance, each brush of their hands, each pause carried meaning far beyond the words themselves. He realized then that emotional connection was more profound than any physical gesture. It was the trust she placed in him, the vulnerability she allowed him to witness. By the time they parted, the park's shadows were lengthening, and the air had cooled. Yet, neither of them stepped away abruptly. The gentle warmth of shared presence lingered, a quiet tether between them. For the first time, he felt the pull of something that went beyond curiosity, beyond attraction, a slow, deliberate connection that demanded patience, respect, and attention. In that fleeting, golden moment, the story of them began to deepen. Vulnerability, he realized, was not weakness. It was the doorway to intimacy, and she had just opened it, just enough for him to see the heart she carefully protected. It was an ordinary evening at the same quiet cafe, but the air felt heavier than usual. He had arrived early, hoping to see her, anticipating the warmth of her presence, the subtle pull of their last encounters. She arrived a few minutes later, smiling as she caught sight of him. But something was different. There was a faint hesitation in her step, a slight tension in the curve of her shoulders, as if she were holding something back. He noticed immediately. Before he could speak, another presence drew her attention. A man, a friend, or perhaps an acquaintance, leaning casually as he approached, greeting her with a familiarity that made the lines around her eyes tighten ever so slightly. She laughed at something he said, a soft, polite laugh. But it was different from the spontaneous warmth he had heard before. His chest tightened. He tried to focus on the conversation at hand, forcing himself to engage. But every laugh she gave to the other man felt like a small ripple across the calm surface of his heart. He watched the subtle gestures, the way her hand brushed lightly against the table when she gestured, the slight backward tilt of her head as she smiled at him. These small movements, which normally captivated him, now carried an undertone of distance. A pang of jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar, cut through him. Not the possessive kind, but the ache of realizing that her attention, her warmth, could extend elsewhere. His mind raced with questions. Had he misread her earlier kindness? Was he imagining the intimacy he felt in their shared silences? The gentle brush of her hand against his arm, the quiet confidences, the subtle glances. Had they meant as much to her as they did to him? When the other man left, he noticed her exhale, a small release of tension that had been hidden behind her polite composure. She looked at him, eyes meeting his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of guilt, or perhaps understanding. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. Her hand, resting briefly near his on the table, trembled slightly before she moved it back, and the weight of her unspoken thoughts pressed on him. He realized in that moment how easily misunderstandings could grow from what was never meant. He had allowed his hope, his longing, to fill in the spaces between them, assuming a depth that hadn't yet been openly shared. And yet, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, the curiosity, the admiration, the quiet yearning that had grown with every encounter. They didn't speak about the tension directly. Instead, they continued their conversation cautiously, their words lighter, more measured. But the subtle friction remained. A glance held a beat too long. A touch lingered a moment too short. The world outside the cafe seemed sharper, more immediate, while the connection between them balanced on the delicate edge of what was spoken and what was left unsaid. By the time they parted that night, he felt the ache of closeness lost and the yearning for understanding more deeply than before. The misstep was not hers, nor entirely his. It was the natural friction of hearts learning to navigate each other. And in that ache, he realized something vital. The story between them was not meant to be easy. Its depth would come from patience, from resilience, and from the quiet courage to keep returning to each other, despite misunderstandings and fleeting doubts. It was late evening when he found her again, this time at a quiet street lined with amber streetlights, their glow reflecting softly on the pavement. The world felt hushed, as if it had deliberately stepped aside to give them space. He had spent the day replaying the moments of their last encounter, the polite smiles, the fleeting tension, the subtle ache of unspoken misunderstanding. Tonight, he resolved he would simply be present, without expectation, without assumption. She was already there, leaning against the railing of the small bridge that overlooked the calm water below. Her eyes were distant, tracing the faint ripples of the river, her expression contemplative, almost fragile. As he approached, the familiar pull rose in his chest, the combination of admiration, curiosity, and a deep, unspoken longing he could no longer ignore. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly. She glanced up, startled, then smiled, the kind of smile that held relief and warmth. She didn't say a word, simply moved slightly to let him stand beside her. The air between them was thick with words unsaid, glances held, and the lingering tension of emotions barely contained. They walked slowly along the bridge, side by side, the space between them shrinking almost imperceptibly with each step. His fingers brushed hers when he shifted slightly, and instead of recoiling, she let her hand hover near his. He felt the warmth of her presence more intensely than ever before, the gentle radiance of someone who had been guarded, but now allowed herself to be seen. Finally, she spoke, voice low and deliberate. She admitted, in fragments, her uncertainty, her hesitation, the way she had been wary of letting anyone in. Each word carried the weight of lived experience, the vulnerability of someone who had been hurt but still longed for connection. He listened without interruption, absorbing the depth of her honesty, and in that quiet attentiveness, she felt seen. Not just noticed, but truly understood. He reached out then, lightly, almost instinctively, placing a hand on the small of her back. Not demanding, not forceful, but steady, a gentle support. She leaned subtly into him, resting a moment of trust on the quiet steadiness of his touch. Their fingers brushed again, this time intentionally, lingering just long enough for them both to feel the quiet intensity of the moment. For the first time, he understood the depth of what he felt. It wasn't infatuation, it wasn't fleeting attraction. It was a deliberate care, a respect for her pace, and a recognition of the layers that made her who she was. And she, in turn, realized that he wasn't simply captivated by her presence. He was drawn to her essence, the way she carried her experiences, her strength tempered by vulnerability. They paused to look out at the water, the soft lights reflecting in her eyes. No words were needed. In that stillness, everything unspoken became clear. The misunderstandings, the fleeting doubts, the small moments of connection, all of it had led them here. As they stood side by side, fingers brushing, breaths mingling in the quiet night, the story that had begun with accidental glances and fleeting touches now blossomed into understanding, desire tempered by respect, and the undeniable pull of hearts meeting with intention. Tonight, the ache of uncertainty was replaced by clarity. They had found each other, and the depth of what was to come lay quietly, patiently between them. The weeks that followed were quiet, deliberate, and unhurried. Each meeting, each conversation, felt like a carefully woven thread, stitching together a connection that neither of them had rushed nor forced. The city around them moved in its usual rhythm, but within their shared moments, time seemed to slow, allowing laughter to linger, words to breathe, and silences to carry meaning without pressure. They often met in small, unassuming places, a cafe bathed in late morning sunlight, a quiet park path where the rustle of leaves was the only accompaniment, or a balcony overlooking the city as twilight settled in. In each encounter, the intimacy between them grew not through grand gestures, but through subtle, meaningful touches, a hand resting lightly on a shoulder, fingers brushing when passing a book, the quiet steadiness of leaning close to hear a whispered thought. Each touch carried warmth, trust, and an unspoken promise. He began to notice the nuances of her presence with a deep, deliberate attention. The way she laughed at small absurdities, how her hair caught the light just so, how she instinctively placed her hand near his when she sought comfort or reassurance. And she, in turn, began to mirror his quiet attentiveness, leaning slightly closer in conversation, sharing a fragment of her day with a trust that felt sacred, and offering subtle gestures of affection that spoke louder than words ever could. One afternoon, they found themselves cooking together in her kitchen, the air filled with the scent of fresh herbs and warm bread. Their movements were naturally coordinated, hands brushing over bowls, a shoulder nudging lightly against his as he reached for a spice. He caught her gaze across the counter, and in that fleeting moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. The laughter that followed was soft, genuine, and free from pretense, carrying the weight of shared comfort and connection. Even in silence, their closeness was palpable. Sitting side by side on a park bench, she rested her head lightly against his shoulder, feeling the steadiness of his heartbeat, the warmth of his presence offering a rare sense of security. He, in turn, felt a quiet completeness in the rhythm of her breath, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the trust she placed in him simply by being near. Through it all, there was no rush, no urgent need to define what they shared. The depth of their bond was evident in the everyday gestures, the cups of tea shared in early morning light, the gentle brushing of hands while walking, the quiet reassurance of being seen and understood. It was a romance built not on passion alone, but on the steady, enduring warmth of emotional intimacy, respect, and mutual care. By the time evening fell, they found themselves again on the balcony overlooking the city, fingers intertwined, sharing the comfortable quiet that only true connection allows. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that spoke of gratitude, trust, and the quiet joy of being with someone who truly understood her. He returned the smile, feeling the steady reassurance that she was his, not in possession, but in presence and heart. And in that moment, the story that began with fleeting glances, accidental touches, and tentative curiosity reached its fulfillment. He no longer meant nothing, and she no longer gave everything in vain. Together, they had found a balance of affection, trust, and understanding. A slow-burn romance completed, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet certainty of hearts aligned.